Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first in this year's series of CAF Philanthropy webinars. I'm Joanna Walker, the Head of Private Clients here at CAF Philanthropy, and we're absolutely delighted to have you join us today and to be kicking off our new series of webinars with a small topic, which we're going to investigate, analyse and solve by 3 p.m. this afternoon in London. So thank you so much for joining us. Just want to introduce today the subject that we're going to be talking about. We have a fantastic panel of 4 speakers who are each going to bring their own individual expertise to the webinar and the subject of biodiversity loss. For those of you who have not joined these webinars before, a little bit of housekeeping on how they work. So what we're really aiming for today is that each of you who are listening will learn something that you didn't necessarily know before, find something out about biodiversity loss and its impact on the human population and what we can potentially do about it, and hopefully by the end of the session be inspired to go and do something yourself, whether it's find out more, support an organisation or connect and read up on the subject. So by all means keep your ears open, and we'd like you to get involved as well. So this is very much an interactive session. We've got a lot to cover today, so in my role of keeping things on track and making sure that we have enough time for everybody to talk about the amazing amount of information they know and their expertise, I'm going to save the questions and answers for the end. So for those of you who've dialed in before, sometimes we have them through, but I'm going to keep them to the end today. And so if you'd like to ask a question, send it in using the chat function on the webinar software at any point. We've had some already, which is great, so thank you for sending those in. But if there's any kind of questions you have that come up as we're going through and talking to the speakers, by all means send them in and we'll do our very best to answer them towards the end of the webinar. If there are questions that are a bit more involved or we run out of time, we'll follow up and send you specific answers to those personally. And also we're going to follow up the webinar with some further information, resources and a copy of the recording in a little time afterwards. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce this webinar. It's something I've been wanting to do a webinar on climate change and biodiversity for quite some time now. We did a survey in early 2017 of our clients at CAF, and climate change, environmental conservation issues came up as the 4th most popular cause that people are interested in. And I think certainly in the last sort of 12 months really, it's really heightened on the agenda, and there appears to be a few things coalescing around that. So we had the Extinction Rebellion protest obviously in the spring in the UK, which did an extraordinary job in 2 weeks of shifting this conversation onto the front pages of the news as opposed to buried somewhere in the middle, which I thought was an extraordinary achievement in such a short space of time. I'm personally spending more time talking to clients, and increasingly climate change and wanting to do something about this is something that's coming up in the agenda, and people are thinking, actually, this isn't something we traditionally were focusing on, but we really want to do more of. And I think in 2019, we're at a critical point ahead of what's been described to me as a kind of global super year in 2020 around climate change. In October, late next year, in Kunming in China, world leaders are gathering to set new targets to protect nature under the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that from our speakers today. So timing is everything, and I think this is the perfect time to be talking about this. Also, as we're having, I think it's the hottest decade we've had this year, so we're all feeling the effects of climate change, although perhaps not today in the UK. So without further ado, let's move on. There are some questions that are coming up throughout. We'll have a couple of questions at the beginning and a short survey at the end. Do please take part and send us the information, so as and when they come up, just use the click function and we can get the answers on those. So first of all, I am happy and delighted to introduce our speakers today. We have 4 speakers, so it's a packed agenda. And our first speaker is Neil Burgess, co-author of the Global Deal for Nature 2020, which he'll tell you more about shortly, and the chief scientist for the UN Environment Programme. So Neil's been working in conservation science and practice for more than 20 years in the UK, Denmark, tropical Africa, and especially Eastern Africa. Neil's going to be talking to you today specifically about the magnitude of the global biodiversity crisis. So Neil, delighted to have you today.
Thanks very much. Do you want me to do my piece now?
No, just in a moment. I'll just introduce everybody and then I'll come back to you to say your piece. Neil is dialing into us from Copenhagen, so if there's a minor delay, please do say so. Secondly, we have our second speaker today is Mark Wright, Director of Science at WWF. Welcome, Mark. Mark is going to be talking about, in the face of the scale of the crisis that Neil is going to outline for us, how can we respond to it and is it achievable? So no small feat that Mark's going to talk to about today. Welcome, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Fabulous, thank you. And the third speaker today is Eva Rehse, who's the UK Director of Global Greengrants, which is a grassroots organisation to mobilise resources of communities to protect our planet around the world. Eva's got a long history of doing that, and we'll be focusing today on the grassroots solutions to helping communities who are facing the brunt of the problem. And I think tend to be the people with the least resources are most affected by the impact of biodiversity loss. So really looking forward to hearing what you have to say today, Eva. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Hello, everyone.
Right. And finally today we have Alan Heeks, who is a founder, director, and has funded 2 environmental charities, as chair of one, and has been passionate about this personally for many decades, and we'll be talking about his own personal connection with the issues around biodiversity loss and what he's doing personally as a donor to support these kind of organisations and this issue. So Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, fabulous. So before we hear from Neil, our first speaker, I'm just going to kick things off with a couple of questions which you'll see on your screen now. So the first question, just to give us a sense of the level of expertise in the audience and where you're coming from, please answer the question, how familiar are you with the area of biodiversity loss? Very, moderately, somewhat, slightly, or not familiar at all. So if you'd just like to select one of those, and that will give us a sense of how much people know already. Just take a couple of minutes, wait for that to come through. Okay. And then moving on to the second question. Have you donated to biodiversity loss organisations or causes before? Yes, no, or don't know. So just take a quick moment to do that. That would be great. So it seems that most of our audience is slightly familiar, somewhat familiar with the information, but not hugely familiar. So actually there's an awful lot of people who are interested in finding out a lot more. So we look forward to learning more today. And in terms of people who already support, most people don't. So there's an army of people out there we can convert, which is great. That's part of my mission today. So and a few people, probably about a fifth of people, have already supported organisations. So thank you for doing that. That's great. That's very helpful. Without further ado, let's move on to Neil, who's going to talk to us about the global biodiversity crisis. Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. So I'm going to talk to you about the global biodiversity crisis from the point of view of a UN-linked organization called UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, sitting in Cambridge. And I'm going to first ask the question, why do I call it a crisis? So next slide, please. So I'm calling it a crisis because if you look at this graph, the very tiny little wedge of gray at the bottom of the graph shows the historical extinction rate of species. So it's a very tiny line, but then when you look at all the graphs going rapidly up for fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, and amphibians, that's the current extinctions that have been seen in the last 100 years for those taxa. So it's far higher rate than the geological background, and it's indeed estimated to be 100 to 1,000 times faster than the historical rate of extinction. And in the recent assessment by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a huge mouthful, but it's just coming out, this assessment, they've estimated that there's up to 1 million species which are facing extinction in coming years. So it's definitely a huge problem. Next slide, please. But it's not only a problem for the species themselves, it's also a problem for people. And again, this is from the IPBES assessment that's in the process of coming out. And this shows the benefits that people get from nature, or nature's contributions to people. And the little red arrows and the orange arrows show that those benefits that we're getting from nature are in decline. So what we can get in terms of fisheries, what we can get in terms of regulation of freshwater quality, freshwater quantity, regulation of soils, all the things that kind of underpin some of our societal kind of needs and the way that the human society is structured are in trouble. So that's the two major reasons why I say we have a crisis. So next slide, please. But why is this? Next slide, please. And again, from the IFBES assessment, they've looked at all of the things which are driving this biodiversity decline, which goes across species and habitats and nature's contributions to people. And by synthesizing all the available data and knowledge across terrestrial, freshwater and marine systems, including scientific knowledge, but also, I think importantly, knowledge from indigenous people and local communities. So they brought all that knowledge together. And the major drivers of change are land and sea use change, which is basically agriculture, land use change, conversion of habitats from natural to domesticated, direct exploitation, hunting and fishing on land and sea. Climate change is a major driver. Pollution, invasive alien species, which is where, for example, you might have mice invading a small island in the Pacific and causing problems to the species which are naturally on that island or other species like that. So this is the direct drivers of the problem. Next slide, please. And they've looked at the kind of indirect, so what's driving those direct drivers, if you like, and it's, you know, issues of human population growth, the way we live our lives, the economic system, technological developments, the way institutions are run, the way the kind of global system operates, inequality in governance, conflicts, wars, epidemics, things like that. So some of the major kind of societal problems are the ultimate drivers of the things that really impact on biodiversity and causing this crisis of extinction and loss of function and sort of generic problems across the world. So next slide, please. But as Joanna said at the beginning, next year will be a major year where opportunities are there to make significant change at the intergovernmental level. So there was the Paris Climate Agreement was agreed in 2015. So that's the major framing for dealing with climate change. But there's a really critical meeting next year that probably will be in the UK. That will bring all the governments together around the world to talk about climate change, and businesses and investors to kind of worry about and deal with the issues at hand. The second major event next year is in China, in Kunming, and it is the Convention of Biological Diversity's meeting where they will agree the next 10-year plan to try and reduce biodiversity loss and indeed reverse biodiversity loss if at all possible. They will come up with a global biodiversity framework or a new deal for nature or a global deal for nature, depending on how you want to frame the language, but a new agreement anyway. And underpinning these things, there are these major kind of things which I totally agree with Joanna on, the mass mobilization of people, Extinction Rebellion and those kinds of events. Greta Thunberg, people like that have had a major important role in catalyzing change. So they're helping mobilize the people to make these international agreements a success. It's also affecting the financial markets and companies who are seeing changes in financial flows, people pulling out of climate damaging investments, they're pulling out of biodiversity damaging investments. So that's quite a significant change that I see in my world. And I think there's a major push towards, you know, more sustainable production and consumption, food production systems, supply chains from around the world. These are all things that I think are going to change a lot in the coming year. And so 2020 could be a really major event in the planet's history. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, yeah, thanks. But there are two major areas where I think people can get involved. I mean, the first part coming from the Global Deal for Nature paper, and our analysis is that one of the major responses we must do is to have a fairly large percentage of the land and sea under some kind of protected or restored or sustainably managed regime. So that could be by communities, it could be by the state, it could be by different actors, could be the private sector. So there's a huge opportunity for engagement by many people in protecting and conserving land and sea. But there's also a huge opportunity to try and reduce those drivers of biodiversity loss, which could be summarized as better agriculture, smarter infrastructure, reduced waste, sustainable hunting and fishing, stopping the illegal wildlife trade, eradicating invasive alien species on islands in particular, dealing with plastic pollution in the oceans, reducing the use of pesticides and other toxins in the general system, and addressing the kind of drivers of climate change. So there's enormous amounts of stuff that can be done in all of those areas by all aspects of society. Next slide, please. And I just want to summarize here with the sort of like, there are these two areas. If you want to know more of the challenges and the solutions, the IPBES Global Assessment draft summary for policymakers is on that URL that summarizes a lot of this information in an accessible format. And then this Global Deal for Nature paper, which is also making a lot of proposals on the way forwards, is summarized in that link there. But all of this will feed into these two meetings next year, where I think societal pressure and pressure from everybody is important to make those agreements successful, to have a really powerful new deal for nature that runs for the next decade and changes the downward spiral of biodiversity loss into something much more hopeful. That's my quick summary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. That was great. I think you've done a great job of really setting out for us just the sheer scale of the sixth mass great extinction or great mass extinction. And for me, the ideas that you've sown to say, here are some potential ways that we can address this, are really what we're hoping to see happen in 2020. I know, just one of the meters is in China and one, you said potentially in the UK. What's the timing of the Paris Climate Change Agreement review?
So next year's meeting, if it happens in the UK, is when the Paris Climate Agreement will actually come properly into force, and countries will have to make their commitments. So it's the real sort of operationalization of what countries committed to in 2015. I guess there's one possibly negative point there, or sad point, is that the USA may well fully pull out next year, because they're partly pulled out at the moment. But that will be a loss to the world, I think. But every other country on Earth is committed to addressing climate change, and next year will be a hugely important year to see what those commitments actually say. Yeah,
absolutely. That's great. Thank you. Well, moving on to Mark now. I think you've sort of set it up very well for Mark to tackle the no small subject of how can we respond to this situation, and is it achievable? Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks, Neil. Yeah, great introduction. I think Neil was absolutely right to pose this as a crisis. I think variously it's been described as an emergency elsewhere. We would absolutely concur with that. But let's remember that's the here and now. This is in 2020, 2019, 2020. We're seeing this issue. As we look forward over time, what will be the great challenge we have to face? Is it climate change? Is it biodiversity loss, and so on? And we're restricted in some sense by the language we use. We tend to put things in silos, but we imagine WWF and much of the conservation organisations view this as a triple challenge. So as we get to, say, 2050, for the sake of argument, what we need to have developed is a planet that is capable of meeting the needs of 10 billion people. We're currently 7.5 billion people. So as we move to 10 billion people, suddenly the pressures on the planet may have increased by 50%. So how do we meet their needs? That's primarily energy and food needs. At the same time, how do we keep the climate to below a 1.5 degree increase in global warming? And at the same time, how do we free up space so that nature can recover? Because the decline has been so drastic in such a short space of time, we're no longer in a situation where we can be happy with the fact that we talk about slowing the decline or reducing the decline. We have taken it too far already. We have to say that decline has to stop. More importantly, it has to recover. So the question then is can we actually do that? Is it possible to meet all those three things at the same time? We would argue that we have to do all those three things at the same time, because let's be really, really blunt about this. We will not be able to deliver on Paris. We will not be able to deliver on climate change if we do not address the loss of nature. We will not be able to meet human development needs if we don't address the loss of nature, because these three things, these three elements are absolutely intertwined. So if we're going to kind of provide a sustainable future for ourselves and for our children, we have to address all three. At the same time, we have to also think about, well, what does that mean for us as people? Because we often talk about how do we solve the problem of. Let's also think about how do we prevent that problem in the first place. So rather than think about how do we soak up a lot of extra carbon, how do we reduce the amount of carbon we produce in the first place? Instead of saying, how do we mop up all that plastic in the ocean, let's talk about how do we stop using plastic in the first place? So the $6 million question is it achievable? Next question, next slide, please. So there's been some fantastic modeling scenario work being done by some super clever people around the world that tries to answer this question. So can we do those three things? A planet fit for people with a large population, nature and climate? And the answer actually is yes, it is achievable. But of course, there's also a but in there. It requires some significant changes. And the two significant changes of note here for this audience is that we do need to decarbonize our economies as quickly as possible. We do need to come off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. That's an inescapable conclusion. But as Neil pointed out in his presentation, one of the key drivers of habitat loss and therefore species lost around the world is land change, and that is down to food. And when we talk about food, we're largely talking about beef and dairy as being a prime driver for land use. So as we go forward, it's incumbent on us as a species across the globe to be more thoughtful and careful about what is the impact of our diet on the planet, and that's something we will have to address front and center. So at WWF, we're trying to respond to that triple challenge, and I think in a way that in the past, and I've been with WWF for a long time now, I think we are being a lot more I was going to say ballsy. I hope I can say that on air. We've been a lot more ballsy than we were in the past. Yeah, because we recognise that, to be fair, although we have, we've won many of the battles, we're losing the war. So if we really are serious about changing, we have to be a bit more aggressive in talking what we want to get the changes we want. So the four key areas we have is Our Planet, Your World, which is really recognising the fact that as a single organisation, we are not big enough or wide enough to change this. We really need a societal buy into this. We need a mass movement development to make this work. We have to address the food sector, of course. We have to address climate change and what's happening in the polar areas. But also, we also have to do the stuff that perhaps we're best known for historically, which is species and geographies around the world. Because as we're moving towards that systemic change, that change in kind of policy frameworks globally, we don't want to kind of lose things in the process. So let's protect those whilst we're going through systematic change. So when we talk about building a movement, this really is large scale. So I was very lucky. I was the science advisor on the Our Planet project with Netflix. I think in the first month, it went out to 33 million households. So that was something like 150 million kind of pairs of eyes on it in the first month. So but that is indicative of the scale that we're trying to get to. If we are really going to get that groundswell globally to change these things, we really do need to have that awareness across the entire planet. But let's be clear, especially in those kind of high consuming areas of the north and west and north and west of the planet. At the same time, there is a strong call for greater action for campaigning for noise, the Extinction Rebellion, the children's school strikes. We had our own mass lobby of Parliament just demanding of the government, this is what we want from the next generation. Just 3 very quick slides, just to give a sense of the sorts of different scales that we can work out. So we're doing work with the food system in the Cerrado, this enormous 2 million kilometre area in Brazil, where most of the world's soy comes from, causing massive kind of clearance of land in that area. A lot of it goes to China as animal feed. So that's on a massive scale of the type of intervention we need to work on. Next slide, please. Different scale of transboundary work in Kenya and Tanzania. This is trying to link up all the protected areas across that transboundary landscape, bringing in communities so that they are a vested part of that solution. And then maybe more prosaic and slightly more unusual one is the eelgrass, and it's eelgrass around the UK. Doesn't look very sexy, doesn't look like, it doesn't have the same appeal as coral reefs, but this stuff is phenomenally good at storing carbon. It's phenomenally good as a nursery for really important commercial stocks, and it's in massive decline around the UK. So trying to intervene at all these different levels. And as Neil alluded to, 2020 is absolutely a critical super year. This is our moment to get it right, because we will be setting up a blueprint for the planet. This is what we need to get it right. And something that Neil didn't have time to say is we've had these blocks of targets in the past. I mean, this is, I think, the third block, the third time we've tried to get these targets. And let's be fair, we have not succeeded in the past. We have fallen well short. So it's incumbent on us, or everyone listening, it's individuals, businesses, to go to government, the people who go to China and say, look, you are talking on our behalf. We demand a better future. We demand you represent us in the way that we want, because we demand to have a good planet which is sustainable for us and for nature. So I'll just leave with our kind of flagship, our call to action. I think we are fighting the frail world. That's what it is now. This is a fight. This is a battle, because at the moment we are inexorably losing what we hold most precious, and we do have the chance to turn it around. If I can leave you with one last figure, just to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge ahead of us. If you could miraculously weigh all the mammals on Earth, and we're all mammals, you could weigh all the mammals on Earth, 96% of that weight would be ourselves, humans, and our livestock and our pets. 96%. 4% is blue whales, aardvarks, bears, polar bears, and so on. 4%. That is not a planet at peace with itself. That is not a planet in balance. It's time we change that. Thank you very much.
Extraordinary, Mark. Thank you so much. And I like the slightly more aggressive tone that people are taking these days. I think it's required. Are you feeling hopeful? Do you think we'll do it?
You have to be optimistic, and yes, I do. I think we are seeing changes in Europe. We're seeing a kind of per capita decline in meat consumption. We're seeing things like Extinction Rebellion in a way we've never seen before. So I think there's a mood. I've got 2 children in their 20s. They want to know what's going on. They want to know what we can do about it. And actually, in a sense, they're pointing at us and saying, look, why did you get it so badly wrong?
Yes, very true. I think that pester power is really working at all levels, actually, which is great. Thank you so much. Moving on to Eva now. So Eva Rehse from Global Greengrants. So Mark has given us the perspective from sort of national, transnational impact and movement, but ultimately the grassroots also has a huge role to play in this. Eva, tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Global Greengrass and how you're making a difference.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think in some ways I'll take us down a notch more to the community level, but really touching on a lot of things that have already been mentioned, and talking about how biodiversity loss impacts people's lives, especially in rural communities in the global south, and how the communities that are the most affected are finding solutions to biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Global Greengrants Fund. We are a charity. We've been around since 1992 and in the UK since 2015. Our vision is on the screen. We really want to help build the most effective environmental justice movements. And why are we doing this? Because we see so much of the power and impact of local communities when they take ownership of protecting the environment. And Extinction Rebellion has been mentioned a few times now already. And we see what these kind of rebellions look like all over the world, when the most affected people who are traditionally marginalized from the larger processes, environmental protection processes, step into these roles of becoming protectors of the environment. Critically, also, these solutions are extremely underfunded, and I'll be saying a bit more about that as well. So we do our work in supporting these local community initiatives through a network of volunteer advisors who are experts in their fields and also have this interesting combination of a lived and learned experience. So they're really bringing in our strategies and decision making from the perspective of people living in the countries where the biodiversity loss is felt the most. We do that through small grants, through mentoring, through convening, and working with our supporters. We've supported over 13,000 initiatives since we started. Next slide, please. So this is really what I want to focus on. So what does biodiversity loss actually mean for us as people? And Neil already hinted at some of this, but I want to quickly talk about these 6 points here. And the first one is on food security or insecurity, because as we've heard, biodiversity is really essential for the sustainable functioning of nature and the ecosystems on which we humans depend to survive. And 75% of the food that we eat comes from just a dozen crops and really 5 animal species. And I think that's just worthwhile bearing in mind in terms of talking about diversity. And those communities that are living rurally, smallholder farmers, fisherfolk, forest dwellers, are directly dependent on it for their livelihoods, but so are we for our diets. And we know that by 2050, Africa, for example, is expected to lose about 50% of its birds and mammal species, and the fisheries in Asia are almost certainly going to collapse if we continue on the track that we're on. So just to keep that in mind in terms of security, and obviously very much connected to that is vulnerability. So there's an economic argument that global biodiversity loss is going to be valued at around $50 billion. And that's obviously, in terms of economic growth, is a question of can we continue on this path that we're on? But then thinking about the increased natural disasters that we're seeing all over the world that are obviously being exacerbated by biodiversity loss. And that then in itself has a health dimension. People are, we all are dependent on the quality of the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink. Nature is also often our pharmacy, and all of that is impacted by the loss of biodiversity. I want to mention water in particular because biodiversity is so critical to the maintenance of quality and quantity of water supplies. And that is something that will be more and more also a source of conflict. And we heard about the drivers of biodiversity loss. So there, this circle sort of closes again. And then finally, I want to talk about social relations and the way that biodiversity loss disrupts a lot of traditional and spiritual relationship with nature. I think that's true for communities everywhere, including here, how we relate to nature. And then that the fact that we lose choice, we lose action in terms of how we carry out our lives, our livelihoods. There was the link to the Sustainable Development Goals and poverty, again, quite clear. So the initiatives that we support at Global Greengrants Fund really tackle all of these impacts in an integrated way. And we in particular support those communities and people within communities that are traditionally most marginalized from bringing in their solutions. So women, young people, indigenous people, and people with disabilities. So I quickly want to give two examples of what this actually looks like. If we can have the next slide. So these are two examples of communities we have supported. This is Yaspencel women sorghum farmers in East Flores in Indonesia. These women reintroduced sorghum into their farming. Sorghum is a very traditional plant. It's resilient, it's nutritionally superior. It can withstand droughts and rainy seasons. You can harvest it up to 3 times a year. And all of this is much more preferable to rice, which is much more vulnerable, which can only be harvested once a year and really relies on pesticides to survive in this context. So we supported this group to save the seeds, the sorghum seeds, and start rolling out a program across the farming communities to make people more resilient to biodiversity loss, but also help save this very important plant that was dying out. And what I want to say in the context of this, this work is that we really see a gender perspective here to biodiversity and biodiversity loss, because in particular, seed saving is seen as a women's role. It's a job in the domestic sphere. And women play across the biodiversity conservation field an absolutely important role, because by society's standards and structures, they're being put into the position of being natural resource manager. And so we know that it's well documented. If you support women's conservation initiatives, then you will get good results, better results, more efficient results in many cases. But this area of work is extremely underfunded. Women's own solutions to environmental protection and conservation are really overlooked in the conservation space. And we've done some research, which we'll share after this webinar. Only 0.2% of official philanthropic funding goes to women's own initiatives, conservation initiatives. And I'd be happy to talk about that more, but I think in the context of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, we have a fantastic opportunity to integrate more gender-responsive policies and also funding into the conversation. Next slide, please. So very quickly, to give a second example, this is a group we've supported in the Congo Basin in Cameroon, Bimbia Rural Development Association, and this group managed to stop the destruction of their local forests in which they have traditionally lived. These are indigenous people who are faced with large-scale rubber plantations plantations. And this is an extremely biodiverse and cultural important area, a rainforest of 735 hectares, home to a wide variety of plants and animals, mangroves, monkeys, high conservation value bird species. And so to actually have this community save 100 hectares of this forest was a huge success. And it also highlights the connection that people have between their culture survival and biodiversity conservation. And my last slide, I just want to reiterate the point that I think we've heard a few times, how important it is for communities to mobilize, to come together around these issues and in fact drive change, and that these initiatives that I mentioned are incredible value for money and have such an important investment on return. I mean, the average grant size that we make is £4,000. And we see very tangible results for the environment and for people. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. That was absolutely fascinating, and good to kind of know that as a donor supporting one of these, there is incredible value for money, as you say, in terms of the direct nature of the interventions. I'm interested in food insecurity in the West. What does that look like in somewhere like London or the UK? We kind of understand what it means overseas, but here to us in the West, what might that look like?
I might not be the best person to answer that, but I think it is worth noting that with those statistics, that around the world, we only live off a dozen crops and 5 animal species. When we're losing these, when we're not ready to save these, will all be affected in the same way, which means that we really have to face food poverty, which is already a big issue here, but also the way we nourish ourselves. And I don't know if there are others here in the round that can contribute to this, but there's obviously a very interesting movement around growing plants artificially and growing food artificially that is very far removed from the communities that we support. I mean, it's almost like another planet of thinking about this when you're thinking about the survival of communities that are affected by biodiversity loss.
Yeah, something we can pick up in the questions, I think. Thank you. Please remember to send your questions through. We'll be getting to them shortly. But before we do, I'd just like to hand over to our fourth and final speaker, Alan Heeks, who's going to talk today, Alan, about your own personal involvement in these kind of issues.
Yeah, so this is a somewhat different perspective, both what I think I and others can do as individual donors, but also about the benefit that small organisations and small projects can add to some of the very good large projects that you've already heard about. I was propelled into the world of charitable giving, somewhat to my surprise, at the age of 38, when a large management buy-in where I was a founder and investor, Carradon PLC, had a very successful public share flotation, and suddenly, from having a sort of ordinary amount of money, I had a few £1 million to my name. And I was always clear that I wanted to use a substantial amount of that capital for charitable wider benefits, and basically I've spent the last 30 years trying to figure out what those are. Early on, I evolved what I call an active giving approach, and I think the how of what I've been doing is probably worth sharing as well as the what. I have a Harvard MBA, which is a very good training for being parachuted into a completely unfamiliar sector, whether it's business or charity. And one of the things that I learned at Harvard was how to find and use expert advice. So one of the first things I did after I'd got this capital was to talk to a few more experienced high net worth individuals about their ways of giving. And there was one gem that has stayed with me. Somebody said to me, don't just give your money away charitably. Find projects that you feel passionate about and invest your time as well as your money in them. And that's very much the thread that I've followed. It does imply more of a time commitment than simply giving money to a lot of good causes. And personally, I've actually found that the research and the networking, the exploration has been a very valuable part of the whole process. And I've done that with existing charities as well as things that I've been involved in setting up. So, for example, I was a fairly significant donor for a small charity called Farm Africa, which is doing some excellent environmental work in East Africa. But rather than simply giving money, I actually did some consulting, some training work in East Africa for them as well, which was incredibly satisfying and really meant I had a direct contact. So over my 30 years of charitable giving, I've set up several of my own projects from scratch, but I have also supported quite a wide range of other organisations. I'm the founder, the main funder, and I've been the chairman of 2 registered charities. You might say, why start from scratch? I think what I felt was that there was an unmet need that I was identifying, and I wasn't aware of an existing charity that was really focused on it. I felt that if I tried to work through an existing charity, there would have been a sort of awkward compromise between their established aims and organisation and something that I clearly wanted to do. And it perhaps was also an example of me applying my business entrepreneurial skills to a charitable venture. So the first of those, if you look at the picture on the top left, that's me with the dairy herd that we set up at a 130-acre organic farm in Dorset. So the charity bought the farm, converted it to organic methods, converted rundown buildings to a residential centre, which is still going, doing particularly environmental education for children and teenagers. The second one, which I'm still involved with, is Hazel Hill Trust, which has created a 70-acre conservation woodland with an off-grid residential centre, and the picture on the top right is our showpiece off-grid building called the Forest Ark. People quite often say to me, I'd love to start a new centre, what's your advice? And my advice is, for goodness sake, don't do it. The amount of work involved is stupendous. Far better to find someone else's if you possibly can. However, the benefits of it are that you do get the chance to pioneer things. So if you like, owning the venue means that you can put things on whether it's commercially viable or not, and you get a chance to learn by your mistakes very rapidly over a long period of time. I have also found a way of creating a new charitable project without actually setting up a registered charity. So for my Seeding Our Future project, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, what I'm doing is actually donating funds from my CAF account to an existing charity, which is then funding them because it matches their aims. Since 2012, ways of raising resilience to future challenges, especially climate change, has been the focus of a lot of my work and of my charitable giving. So I'd like to describe briefly the projects I'm involved with that relate to that topic, partly because I would welcome your support for them, but also because it may provide you with some useful examples. And I would say that as a prelude to anything that you do around climate change, my advice would be, firstly, do your own fact-finding, because even now there's a lot of contra information flying around. Make personal contact with a few experts if you can. But the other thing I would urge you to do is actually to raise your own resilience to working with information which is genuinely alarming. I've really had to work at that over the past few years. So there are 4 specific projects that I'm involved with and funding that relate to this area. First is deep adaptation. This is a completely new project that really only started a year ago, started by Jem Bendel, professor at University of Cumbria, who is also a policy advisor to Extinction Rebellion. So there's a bit of an overlap between the two. And I'd strongly urge you to investigate the whole deep adaptation approach. I think it's a really important addition to the whole issue of climate change responses. I think there's also an interesting example where there is no formal organisation for deep adaptation, and therefore they would have real difficulty going to grant-making trusts. And so they have depended on a few private individuals like me to provide funding for what they're doing. And I've provided that personally rather than through a charitable trust. The essence of what Jem is saying is, along with a number of other people, that the climate change science, if you look at the latest information, says that things are deteriorating at an extremely rapid rate, and that it's quite likely that it is too late to stop catastrophic climate change. He totally supports efforts like Extinction Rebellion to stop it, to change what is happening, but he's also saying we have thought very little about actually how we respond if it does become catastrophic in terms of food supplies and so on, and I could add more on that question if you want. So that's one of the projects I'm financially supporting. I'm also involved in working with Jem. The second is Hazel Hill Trust. So if you are already involved in projects, I would urge you to look at how those projects can actually respond directly to the climate crisis agenda. I'm glad to say that the team I'm working with at Hazel Hill have recognised that we're all in a climate emergency already. And so we're looking at what we can do to respond to that. One of our main responses is actually to raise funds for a new accommodation building, which means that we can host larger groups of up to 35 people and offer upgraded facilities so that we can work with policymakers. And our experience already is that the woodland setting that we offer can be a real catalyst for people. Just getting them out of their own ordinary context can be a major catalyst. Example of that is the group on the bottom left, believe it or not, are doctors on a resilience program at Hazel Hill Wood.
Wow.
And they went back really sort of renewed just from 24 hours in the wood with a healthy ecosystem. The Hazel Hill Wood Project is also worth mentioning in terms of more specifically around biodiversity loss. One of the things that we aim to do is to be a sort of lead indicator in looking at how woodlands can respond to climate change and biodiversity loss in a UK context. So we did a major review last year with a specialist ecologist looking at what climate change impacts will likely be on the habitats in our wood and other woods. So we have expertise there that I'd be happy to share with others if that's of interest.
Great, thank you.
The third project I want to mention is Seeding Our Future. This is a project that I've started myself, not as a registered charity, and its aim is to pilot and prove out a number of innovative approaches to future resilience and responses to climate change. It's quite small scale, and the whole idea is to get proof of concept for a number of approaches that we hope that others will then pick up. One of the projects that Seeding Our Future is running is called Future Conversations. So we're running pilot programs in 3 disadvantaged communities across the UK. The picture on the right is the Future Conversations group in Nottingham, in a inner city area of the city of Nottingham. And what we're doing is facilitating a series of conversations for people within those communities about hopes and fears for the future outlook. We're providing community building skills, and we're also providing know-how and responses on climate change issues. And as you might guess, quite a lot of those responses are actually about local food production and also about local food supply, particularly for vulnerable people, if as I suspect, there will be genuine food shortages in this country in the next few years. The last project I want to mention briefly is about renewing the forests. So one of the ways that I keep informed about climate change is by attending occasional conferences. And at Easter, I was involved with a large international conference at Findhorn Foundation in Scotland. It was a valuably upsetting experience, meeting tribal leaders from Amazonia, meeting people from Zambia, another place in Africa, and hearing from individuals, face to face, the devastation they're already suffering. And as others have said, that these are the people who've done the least to cause the problem are already suffering the most. And it also links to the David Attenborough program, if you'll recall that. The statistic that really shocked me in that was the scale of deforestation and its contribution to climate change. So I know there are a lot of other projects out there. I'm compiling a list of, including a number of small projects, some of them represented at Findhorn, which I'd be happy to share, and I think the link is on the handout.
That's great, thank you.
So I think the final thing I'd say is that although I know the stresses are severe in the UK in all respects, I think one of the things that those of us who are philanthropists in the UK need to do is really bear in mind the needs of other countries in our giving. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely really good to hear about the very direct, practical ways in which you've been involved. And over the 30 years that you've been involved in trying to do something on this agenda and making a difference, how have you seen public opinion or people's response to the projects that you've been working on? Has that changed any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I am a pioneer, and I remember early on somebody saying, well, the problem with pioneer is your work is never understood. What's been satisfying is to see that things got sort of vindicated and people caught up. For example, when I was involved in starting the organic farm back in 1990, organic food was a really eccentric fringe thing, and you couldn't get a premium. And then it was actually mad cow disease in the mid-90s, and suddenly everyone wanted organic. Now, it's become mainstream. So in that sense, I think I share the other people's views that I am hopeful that some of the things that may still seem marginal at the moment will become mainstream and need to very soon.
I think we're starting to see that. It feels certainly to me that things are moving into the mainstream agenda, and certainly with the mass participation and the kind of the year that's coming up, then hopefully it will increase and we can capitalise on that momentum, I think, which is great. Thank you to all of our speakers today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I now have some questions for you, if that's okay, so prepare yourselves, switch your microphones on. I have a question for Neil, actually. On the very first slide that you showed, Neil, with the extinction rates of various species, which of those species decline do you think will have the most detrimental effect on the rest of the planet?
I suspect, in terms of provisioning for, it depends whether we're taking the question from a people point of view or a planetary point of view. In terms of the overall functioning of the planet, all of them will have some kind of functional loss. If we're talking about their impact on people, then I suspect it will be the sort of fisheries kind of end of things that will cause the biggest problems, because so many people are dependent upon fish as a source of protein. So the loss of populations and increased extinction risk of species such as tuna and cod and all kinds of things that are primary staple food for people will have a potentially quite catastrophic impact on many millions of people.
Okay, thank you. And one of the things I'm kind of quite keen for people to take away from today is, am I right in saying that climate change has contributed significantly to biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss is in and of itself contributing to increasing that climate change? So there is a vicious circle that's happening here that people need to understand and be aware of. Is that fair to say? Yes, Mark.
It's completely. Sorry, I'll let Mark do it.
No.
I think I'm going to say what Neil was going to say, actually. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the two are absolutely linked. So, yeah, as climate change comes, it makes all the stresses and issues we have that much worse. But actually, nature is also a solution to some of those climate change problems as well.
And do you think we have technology now that we didn't necessarily have 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to help slow that loss or reverse the trend? I mean, Alan, you shared an article with me around permaculture and aquaculture having an incredible impact in a very zero input way to making manufacturing sea kelp, which really helps with carbon sequestration, and we're happy to share that article. Do you think that we have a technological opportunity we didn't have 10, 20 years ago? Yep.
An example comes immediately to mind. So something like a fifth of all fish which are caught in the ocean are ground up so we can feed them to other fish. So because we get about half of the fish we eat comes from farm fish, and they're fed other fish. So really inefficient way of getting food into us. So now there's very well-established organisations, including some in London actually, where they breed black soldier flies. So the black soldier flies are fed on food waste, potato peelings, coffee grounds, things like that. So this is food which is going to go into landfill. They grow extremely fast. Then you take the maggots, you grind them up. They're very high in proteins, very high in lipids, which is perfect fish food. And then you feed that to fish. So by doing that, you're reducing stuff going to landfill. You're reducing the amount of fish which are taken out of the sea and killed, and you're getting a really good premium fish product at the end of it. It's a win-win-win, which is really unusual in this world. So yes, I think some of the technologies are there, but I think there's also the people are thinking around how can we find solutions to some of these really, really pressing problems. So I think that entrepreneurial spirit should absolutely be promoted going forward.
Thank you. Yes, Alan.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ideas available. And one thing I would highlight is that it's well known that innovation very often comes from small marginal organisations, not from large ones. And hence the example you gave of the marine permaculture arrays, it's quite a small scale thing at the moment. And I would urge people thinking about how they can support this to look at, if you like, the under the radar small organisations, not only the big ones.
Okay, no, good point. Neil, did you want to say something at this point?
Just to add on about, the food production system, the agricultural system is the major driver of biodiversity loss and certainly a major driver of climate change. So the fact that we waste up to 30% of all the food that's produced is completely mad and a criminal thing. So technological solutions to both, allow us to know when food's about to go off and sell it and, do those kinds of things in supermarkets rather than throw it away, and much better understand the food production systems and the transport of food around the world to hit markets in a much smarter way. Anything we can do to reduce 30% food waste is going to have a big impact.
It's a huge proportion that's wasted and doesn't actually do any good. Eva, please.
Yeah, and I agree that technology is really important. Technological solutions and innovation will help us get there. But I think underlying this, and Mark definitely mentioned it, is the need for us to rethink how we live off natural resources and our relationship with nature, and how our economic systems are based on extracting from nature. And these things have to go hand in hand. We have to think about the systems, and Neil just mentioned the food system and the systems that are driving our economic growth. So while technology can help us with that, I don't think it is the solution.
Okay, part of the solution, not the whole thing. And Mark, you mentioned we're going to have to feed and provide energy for 10 billion people at some point in the future. can we do that in a way that's sustainable without large monoculture or huge rice fields or stuff at an enormous scale? Can we do it in a way that is sustainable for biodiversity?
Absolutely. I don't want to sound like the super optimist on the line here, but I am. But I think that when there is scope for doing stuff, because if you look around the world, I mean, the numbers vary. But broadly speaking, people estimate there's something like 2 billion hectares of land which has been used, cleared, kind of degraded for whatever reason, is now kind of fallen out of production. So in other words, there's no, in some sense, there's no real requirement to clear new land for agriculture. There's a great impetus to restore some of that land that has been used and now has been abandoned. To try and put that into context, and it's going to be a funny example of this. I didn't know what 2 billion hectares looked like. I had to give a talk to some Swedes the other day, so I looked it up in Swedish terms. It's 40 times the size of Sweden.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, exactly. So that's how much land is kind of kicking around the planet, which is being used or underutilized. And that is land that we can restore for agriculture, but actually we can allow that to be restored for nature as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's worthwhile adding that 70% of the food that we eat is still produced by smallholder farmers. It doesn't come from the large industrial scale farming. And that's where we need to put our attention to make sure that that can continue happening.
70% on a global scale?
Yeah. Yes.
Goodness me. I'm also slightly shocked that we only eat 12 varieties of food and veg and 5 species. Extraordinary. I've got some questions from the audience, so I must get to them. And if we don't have time to get to your question today, which we may well not, then we will answer them following this conversation and send out email responses. So thank you for the patience. Got some great questions. We have a question for the panel. How can we avoid all of donors' actions being directed towards obvious large species like major mammals, instead of recognising the loss of vital insects, pollinators, dung removers, etc.? Mark, over to you. Are you from WWF? I think that might be one for you.
Yeah, cracking. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, great question. I think you're absolutely right. But I think even within WWF, if you look at where we are targeting our interventions now, we often use a species as a flagship, as a kind of the poster boy or poster girl for that piece of work. But actually, what we're talking about is landscape. So we're talking about how do you maintain the Amazon? How do you maintain the forests of Borneo? How do you maintain the grasslands of East Africa? So within that, if we get that right, if we get the ecosystems properly protected and well managed and so on, yes, you protect the lions, the orangutans, but you also protect the insects that go with it. I think if we're being very specific about insects, and I think insects are a special case, and I'm an entomologist by training, so I have a particular love for these things. I mean, I think we do have to look at our farming systems, and exactly as my colleague said here about the organic becoming more mainstream, I don't think we necessarily have to go fully organic, but we can have a much, much lighter touch in terms of agriculture, and it's absolutely required because on the one hand, whilst we're doing high intensity agriculture, that will in turn have really negative impacts on our freshwater systems and in turn on the marine systems as well. So whilst you win with one hand, you're losing with the other. So we do need to look at that system as a whole.
Thank you. Another question we have is, we mentioned that we've had targets before and missed them. So what makes 2020 different if we miss them again? Is this really our last chance? Perhaps to Neil on that one, and then to Mark if he wants to say anything.
Sure. I mean, it's absolutely true that we've missed the last 20 years worth of targets. We haven't missed all of them. We have missed the majority of them for sure. The key ones that we've missed have been the ones relating to the drivers, so the production systems, the agricultural systems, things like that. So those are where I think the really critical focus needs to be, on making targets that are broadly based and well understood across different sectors. Hence the kind of need for reaching out to a very large number of people, engaging the business community, the investment community, those financial sectors, because that's the sort of like the source of the money that drives the problem, that creates the problem for biodiversity. We've been much more successful at achieving protected area targets and eradicating species off islands and things like that. So we have achieved quite well some of them, but the real driver ones we have not. Is it the last chance? It must be getting towards the last chance to avoid a very depauperate world from a biodiversity point of view, and a world where we may be in 3 degrees C climate change, and that will be a difficult world where we might have mass migration of humans who can't live where they are currently living, and it will not be a happy situation for us if that happens.
Okay, so yep, this is a real sense of urgency around this now. Mark, did you have anything else?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think we missed it in the past because it wasn't really on people's radar. It was kind of the poor cousin in terms of the international convention. So it was sort of junior ministers going along to agreeing stuff, and then it was kind of forgotten about. I think what's very different this time is, well, firstly, it's going to be held in China. So they will want to be able to do something good. They don't want to have a flimsy kind of outcome from them. It's a bit of a flagship for them. But I think also the landscape's changed. So it's not just about kind of green organisations saying we need this. If you look at the last World Economic Forum kind of report, their global risks report, this is the business sector coming out. They looked at their biggest risks to the business sector. What is material for them? Within their top 5, they had climate change, biodiversity loss, and water issues. So the business sector is saying, hold it, we need it, because we recognise this is a business risk for us. So it's not just the green liberals now saying, please look after fluffy animals. This is everyone saying this is material for our well-being and for our economics as well. So I think that landscape has changed. And just the last thing to say is in a sense, what 2020 is not the end, it's the beginning. I think if we don't get it right in Beijing, it will be very difficult to hold governments to account as we go forward. Having it doesn't say to mean we will be successful, but by having those agreements in years to come, we can go back to a government and say, oi, you promised X, Y, and Z, why are you not stepping up to the plate?
And that accountability, I think, is critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think I would agree with you that it does feel that people, organisations, big institutions are starting to talk about the economics of this. And if nothing else, people care about economics. So I think that really, for me, does feel different. So it's a real opportunity. I'm terribly sorry we've run out of time for any more questions. I've got plenty here. Lots of people want to know exactly what deep adaptation is, Alan, so we'll get you to explain that in more detail, and we'll follow up with some